Anyone else?
Basically, what's the thing about the dumping oil next door neighbor? And the dumpsters that are basically rotten smell all the time in their house. And why they're allowed to put there without my permission, knowledge, or approval. And it is on my property. No matter.
Thanks, Bruce. Any questions on stormwater or the water and sewer law or anything? Go ahead.
Yeah, Bob McIntyre, I live on Amy mentioned the stormwater plan that you're doing this survey with the Larchmont, and specifically to what extent is Tamarack included in that study, because we flood about every 3 years pretty extensively. And secondly, who is the A&E firm that you hired on the site?
So our engineering firm for many years has been MRB Group out of Rochester. They are finalizing the engineering report for Larchmont and Tamarack. They have identified a potential solution. And part of the report will be what that will cost. So if the cost is small enough, there's some potential for some state aid, hopefully. If the cost is very large, then we're gonna have to look for some larger grant money to fund that.
Are they still accepting public input?
Yes, and you can send that to Ben, and he will forward that along.
Thank you.
Sure.
I just want to make.
Turn it over.
This is working. I don't know if you're on now. Am I on now? Can you hear me now? I just wanted to make one brief comment. The second, I was on the board, I'm Marcia Horn, by the way. I'm the newest member of the board that was appointed by Warden and accepted the position at the end of June. So I've been here for a very short period of time. I've been trying to catch up, but one comment I did want to make that was a little bit of misinformation. The second water source, I was on the board in 2006. And this is something that has been discussed for probably 20 years or more. And our hand was forced by the health department, and it was required that this village put in a second water source. It has nothing to do with somebody building something, or they were not going to allow us to build anything, not one house, not one garage, not anything in the village until we got that second water source. Our only second water source at the time was a small pump station up on the Hoffmeyer farm, way off on 227. So that was not sufficient to supply the village should something happen with the second water source. So I just wanted to correct that this is something that was mandated by the health department. Our feet were really held to the fire about that. And it took many, many years for us to decide how we were going to solve that problem. So I just wanted to correct that.
You're the wired. Go ahead.
So question is on the sewer water and storm drainage. As far as what you're asking some people to give you information, are you asking them as far as documenting, like either rained and how many inches you think you've got in your backyard, because there's flooding that goes across the center of the backyard, around to the left and up to the creek or whatever it is. And because, I mean, maybe not everybody can or has email on their cell phone so that they could pass on a picture or something. So what exactly, how do you want the information to come across?
Yeah, really as much or as little as anyone feels comfortable with. I think an ideal would be, if you can take some pictures and say what day it was. And send them along, we can look back at the record of how much rain had fallen and that sort of a thing, and kind of, that'll do quite a bit. So as simple as that. Now, like you said, not everyone's got cell phone, takes pictures. If you want to take pictures on any phone and print them off and bring them into the village office and hand them off, that's totally fine. Kind of any sort of way that you can document in any words. If you want to just kind of even just write up a description of kind of what's going on. Obviously, some input's going to be more helpful than others, but really any input can be helpful in just kind of getting a sense of what the issues are, even if it just means that's an area that we'll go back and look at, with an engineering firm at a later date or something. So any opportunity that people have to pass in any information, I'm sure we'll make some use of it one way or another.
Okay. Very brief update on Camp Barton. This is February is the 1-year anniversary of when we announced that there was a project in the works in conjunction with the towns of Ulysses and Covert to manage what is historically been known as the Boy Scout camp at Camp Barton once it is acquired by New York State Parks. We established about an 18-month timeline, and I'm happy to say that we are on schedule, maybe slightly ahead of schedule. The Boy Scouts are in negotiations with New York State Parks over the acquisition of the property. The towns are in the process of forming what we're calling an LDC, a local development corporation, which is a specific and unique carve out of state law that allows for the municipalities to form a not-for-profit entity for certain economic development purposes, and operating a state park would qualify. I'm hoping that by this fall, we will be very close to completion of this. And I do want to just say as an aside, been doing this for a while now. I don't recall, certainly in my tenure on the village board and in my historical knowledge going back another couple of decades before that, I don't recall a period of time where the relationship between the town of Ulysses and the village of Trumansburg has ever been better. Certainly in our history, going back to our founding, as we made a little bit of fun of in our play last year during the sesquicentennial celebration. Relationship between the town and the village has been testy at times, and I certainly have experienced that over the last 15 years. But this current town board and its membership, and this current village board and its membership have a level of cooperation and collaboration that I have never seen before. Mary Bouchard's in the audience, town board member, village resident, by the way. We went about a decade without village representation on the town board, so it's great that we have that. So to all of the members of the town board, should they hear of this or watch this later online, thank you for your continued cooperation and collaboration. Because we are ahead of schedule, if anyone has specific Camp Barton questions, yeah, go.
Sorry, if I can jump in real quick. I was told that folks on the live stream are having a hard time seeing the screen, the slides. So I put them on the news item on the front page of the website. You go to the State of the Village agenda and meeting information, there's slides there for anyone who's on the live stream. You can follow along.
One last thing, the reason why it says TBD State Park, we have not settled on a name. So there may come a time when the community is asked to help name the future State Park down at Camp Barton.
Good morning, Joel Kaminer, Trumansburg. I've been to the meetings with the state park and the town board and I wanted to applaud Gordon and the village, the town for spearheading this. It's difficult, it's extra work for the village, but a great opportunity for all of us Just in a word, and I watched, for instance, as Rodney spoke about smaller towns having more expenses. Town in Colbert wanted to know, what would it cost us? How is this going to affect our bottom line? We just lost one of our community citizens, Bill Wright, Scoutmaster. There was a memorial for him last Saturday. So representing the scouts, Bill stood right up and said, we'll mow the grass. We'll keep the barracks clean in the spirit of volunteerism. And I just wanted to bring that up, that we're gonna miss Bill, but thank you to the village for taking this on.
Thanks, Joel.
Meryl Hurst, I live on Cayuga Street. Feel privileged to live on Cayuga Street. It's a beautiful. Oh, sorry, the people in the back can't hear you, Meryl. I'm Meryl Hurst. I live on Tom and I live on Cayuga Street, and we love living there. It's a beautiful walkable street. We have hundreds, maybe, but 20 people and their dogs walking by our house every day. I'm wondering what you think, what kind of change there'll be in traffic once the park opens for public use.
So certainly with respect to non-village residents, so folks coming to the area, like all state parks, it'll be state roads that are indicated as the best way to get there. For village residents, it's probably either going to be Cayuga Street or Lake Street that sees that traffic. Seneca Road as well. So I think one of the things we will have to look at is, so when we think about Camp Barton, it's a beautiful piece of property, but it's not that big. So when we hear 90 acres, that sounds like a lot, but it's not a gigantic piece of property, and parking is light down there. So one of the things we've been in discussion with at the municipal level as we form this organization is we're already thinking ahead, how much programming are we going to be able to do there? It's not like Taganic where they can have park 500 cars on the lawn. We don't have that kind of space. So I think there will be some self-limitation to the use of the space, which will then have the outward ripple effect of things like traffic and so forth. But certainly from the state park perspective, when we look at a piece of property showing up on state level maps, here's Taganic State Park, here's TBD State Park. It's always going to be the state roads that see the heaviest flow of traffic. Frontenac Road going down to the park, certainly we'll see an increase in traffic. But this was part of the conversation in the beginning, is it either gets sold into private hands and then you're going to see an increase in traffic down there for whatever that piece of property is purposed for, or it becomes state property and then we see a increase in traffic with community benefit. Any other Camp Barton? Yeah.
Is the state then responsible for maintenance and costs and liabilities, insurance and all that?
No,
Does that fall to the village?
it falls to the LDC. So there are 2 or 3 other state parks that have this model where the state owns the property. It is an official state park, but they contract the management of the property to a third party entity. And so this LDC formation is part of the important piece of this, is which municipalities are participating. In this case, the village and the 2 towns. What is the structure of that entity going to be in terms of decision making? And the good news is there are, to my knowledge, no state parks that lose money in terms of revenue. So the LDC gets to be the operator, and part of what we will have to negotiate with parks, which sounds like it's gonna be an interesting conversation, but part of what we get to negotiate with parks is, should we turn a profit? Which is highly likely. How much of that do the municipalities get to keep? Albany would like to say none of it. We would like to say all of it, and I expect we'll end somewhere in the middle. Yeah, it'll be, you'll pay to get into the park, just like you do at Taganic. We'll have to honor Empire passes. We will be able to do events, you know, so part of the business model, how are we going to make money there to keep it at, my hope is at worst, self-sustaining. That's what the LDC will, as an organization, that's what we will have to develop. And, you know, fortunately, we have the headquarters of the entire Finger Lakes Park system 6 miles up the road, and their decades of institutional knowledge and expertise. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel on how to operate a state park. And we have good relationships in that office. We can use they've already provided us with their expense and funding models, so we can see how much of what they do can we emulate. We're not trying to be another Taganic, so there's some differences there, but we don't have to make this up out of whole cloth. We have a model that we can follow. Okay. We will have an update briefly right now from our police department and Trustee Hannon.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks everyone for coming out today, facing the cold. Always good to see this room full. Are we still under schedule or ahead of? We are.
We're right on schedule.
We're right on schedule. That's a lot of pressure. So I won't stand because I'll get chatty if I stand. I turn into a talk show host. I don't want to do that. So let's jump right in here. Quick call summary for 2022 for our police department. We responded to 2,059 calls in 2022. Calls continue to do on average tick up around the village, and as well as our assisting calls outside of the village, which seemingly all of our departments seem to be doing more and more, going back to what Gordon talked about earlier. Want to recognize our department. Well, first I want to recognize we're now roughly 5+ years into Chief Joe Nelson's tenure, and just want to continue to state publicly how fortunate I believe we are to have Joe, especially during quite a difficult time as we continue a national conversation about policing. I can't think of anyone better to be running our department right now. And so I want to recognize him. Amy Smith is here today. I want to continue to recognize her endless decades of service to our police department, and all of our officers who are all really impressive people. Joe does a great job taking our officers. I'll get more to that in a minute. With that said, our department was recognized a couple months ago by the Ithaca Kiwanis Club with the Frank Hammer Award, which is a monthly award they give to either a local department or local police officers specifically, just as a recognition of service. Usually somebody puts you up for that award, and so we were recognized, and you can see that picture in the bottom middle there. So we were really appreciative to be recognized for the work we've been doing in the Trumansburg community. Speed monitoring, I know that seems to come up every state of the village. It came up last year. We've tried to have an increased presence on streets that have been reported to us, specifically Halsey, Bradley Street are 2 streets that come up a lot. So we continue to monitor those streets. We put our speed recording on those streets. And the good news is, 95%, maybe even higher of drivers are in compliance, but we still do get, the occasional car that Marsha can attest to that likes to go 55 on Halsey. And so we do see those get on the reports, but it can also be hard to catch those people if they're not sitting there right now. So all I would say is if you have concerns on your street, continue to bring them forward, and we'll do everything we can. We usually only have 1 car on patrol, so we can't spend 12 hours on one street. all day long, but we'll do the best we can, continue to monitor that. We had our second first responder open house that Trumansburg Police Department kind of takes the lead on, but in collaboration with fire and EMS, and even some county agencies. We did that over at the fire department and great success. A lot of community members came out, a lot of kids. A great opportunity for the community to meet all of our first responders, get into the trucks and the cars, and they even had the what do you call that gear? The harnesses were rope rescue. Kids were getting pulled up on the ropes and they were having a good time. And they even got to help put out some fires behind the, I don't know, I don't think they helped. There was demonstrations. That's probably a liability issue. We set some fires on the back and showed them the different ways to put out different fires. You don't want to throw water on an electrical fire, that thing. So it was a good education, clearly a good education for me as well. And we've had we were really trying to recruit crossing guards and had a hard time doing so. We recently had the resignation of our longtime crossing guard in front of the school, Jerry McIntyre. I want to recognize him for 10 years of service out in front of the school. He moved over to Watkins Glen. And so Chief Nelson was doing a lot of the crossing duties. And sure enough, it turns out the best way to recruit crossing guards is to put a picture of Joe Nelson in the middle of Main Street saying, we need our chief to be focused on other things. And then we were flooded with applicants. So very happy to report that we have 2 new crossing guards now in front of the school. And we had so much interest that we had previously approved a new crossing guard position at South and Wig, and the school district was willing to pay half of that. We just didn't have any people, but now we do. So we will soon have a crossing guard at South and Wig, where we did we monitored that intersection and deemed it really necessary to have some help there. So especially in the morning and afternoon. So we will soon have a crossing guard taking over, helping at South and Wig as well. So we're really happy about that. Lastly, I just wanted to give an update. In April of 2021, we submitted our police reform plan to the state of New York. It was a mandated plan that we had to prepare and submit after having a number of community dialogues to talk about how we were going to improve policing in our municipality. We had 10 goals established that would be addressed over a certain amount of time. Happy to report that we've checked off almost all of them. Some of them still we're not fully at completion yet, but I did want to give you an update on a lot of those. So the first goal was to hire a second full-time officer. Well, we did do that. His name is Dan Bechtold. Maybe you've seen him around. Dan's done an amazing job walking the village and specifically spending a lot of time walking the school district campus in the morning. So he's become a really familiar face to the community. My kids know him, call him Officer Dan. He always chats with the kids, and again, our real focus as a department is to make it a community police department. We want our officers walking around. We want you to be able to talk to them and have casual conversation with them. We don't want kids or adults to only know our officers when they're in trouble. That's not a good way to police the community. And so we're really trying to be present in all areas of the village. We're actually now looking for a third full-time officer. The reason we have these full-time officers as part of the reform plan is because we believe that with full-time officers versus our department previously and going years back was staffed by a variety of sometimes up to 14 different part-time officers who don't live locally, who are coming from other municipalities where maybe they've already put a shift in. So we just feel that full-time officers in the village give you a consistent base that you're going to see around town. It's somebody that's going to do better work because they're not on their second or third shift of the day. And so we think that's a big part of maintaining our community police force that we appreciate and think you do as well. So we will be looking to hire a third full-time officer soon. Second goal was to deploy new body cameras. We've done that. And we've even updated the video capture software so it works better with outside agencies. Up-to-date policies and procedures that relate to use of force and de-escalation. We have updated those policies. A lot of that was state mandated and we did it. Require training for full and part-time officers. Our part-time officers generally get all their training from their full-time agency, but we have added trainings for our 2 full-time officers as well. Some of those include firearms training, school resource training, wellness, mental health trainings. One of our part-timers is actually a crisis negotiation specialist, which is nice to have. And another recent training that one of our full-timers took was training rookie officers in kind of the modern expectations of policing. Encourage ongoing community dialogue. We use the chief's open door policy that remains the same. Joe is very approachable. You can see him on the street at a basketball game. Call him, go to his office. He's always there. Work towards department accreditation. This is a pretty big task. We kind of said it would be when we laid this out. I won't go into the details, but a lot of the work that needs to be done towards accreditation can really only get done if we have a new facility, and that's our priority to get that done. He's talked about first responder facilities and the need to upgrade those. So while we've done things like we've improved our weapons storage and things like that within the department, a lot of the accreditation work is going to have to be done if and when a new facility comes into fruition. Develop process for capturing demographic data for traffic stops. That's being done at the county level. And so there is a group meeting on how to best streamline that process. Right now, we're not collecting demographic data of traffic stops of someone's gender or racial identity. So there's a group meeting to continue to figure out what is the best process for that and how do we get that information into the systems. Refine monthly public discourse, monthly public disclosure of call and traffic data. So we do that every board meeting, and we'll continue to, we're working right now to build out a more robust website, and you'll start to see a lot of that data on the new website for the police department. Lastly, create new public safety committee that will offer feedback and discussion. So we launched the LEAPS committee about a year ago or so, a little over a year ago. We've been meeting every few months. We're due for a meeting soon. So those of you on the committee in attendance, stay tuned. It's been a really, I think it's been a really great opportunity. Chief Nelson gets to talk with the community, and we talk about different issues and concerns and how we should make the village more of a safe, inclusive place for, the entire village. And that's not just, how do we keep people safe from crime? It's about how do we make people feel secure in a lot of different areas of village life. And so it's been great having those meetings. Thank you, Joe, and our officers for coming to some of those meetings and kind of telling their story and their experiences policing our village and beyond if they were at previous departments. So that's been a really great process. That's all I have. Hopefully we're not behind schedule now, but if anyone has any questions about the police department, Bruce does.
Yeah, over the years, for the last 20 years, that I keep asking the state to come up and train the village influencer to start enforcing and obeying ADA law. Every establishment that I walk in with fear. Because I'm harassed, my dog is harassed. The one night 2 years ago, I walked into the restaurant next door to Little Meadow, and she said, "You're in the wrong place." I'm just wondering when the police department and the state is going to coordinate to start enforcing ADA laws in terms of people are not to touch the dog, they're not to push us into a corner, we are to be accepted in public places. And on another thing, what Marcia Warren had said is that I was aware in 2006. But after they got the second store, you merged the trailer park and now want to build the apartment buildings on South Street. That was my point, and the board member said she had done the second source for that apartment building. I just want to clear up what she said. But the thing is that with me and my dog, everywhere we go, I have to watch my back. And I fear my life, my dog's life, because people don't seem to know what the ADA laws are. And the state I keep calling, an example of this is when I went to the Ulysses Court. They pretty much, they did a lot of interesting things there. But there's a lot of things going on that I'd like to clear up if the ADA law. People in the village to be aware of, to know about it. It's like Garrett's, the woman said, don't bring in your dog without a harness on, because you're allowing other people to bring in their dog. That is not my problem. You know, state law clearly states that. So I gave her the state law, but other places, it gets downright nasty. And so I just want to make sure that Joe Nelson and the police and law enforcement to do inform all establishments that what the disability rights are, as well as how people should be, because if they don't know, they're just going to keep on pressing.
Thanks, Bruce. We will, as you see on the agenda, we have a long open Q&A at the end. So if there are any additional questions about the police department. Yeah.
Actually, I just wanted to make a statement. 20 years of working in EMS around the state, mostly the capital district area. Having the opportunity to work with Trumansburg Police Department has been absolutely fabulous. I love the picture in the bottom left with the smiles, because that's just indicative of the police department. They show up in many hard situations with that smile. I've never seen a police force that cares so much about people and carry that smile everywhere. And I really just want to commend the entire department as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Trustee Darfler again for a review of the Comprehensive Plan and Zoning Revision Committee and its processes over the last few years. For those who are not familiar, I'll just preface this intro by way of saying that some of you may recall there was a mildly controversial set of circumstances in the 2017 to 2020 timeframe. And when I became mayor in 2018, we were 10 years in to, or 10 years post adoption of our first ever comprehensive plan. New York State has created as a best practice the idea that comprehensive plans need to be at least reviewed every 10 years. And so I felt that it was a good time to do that, particularly with the controversy over the 46 South Street development as a backdrop. And so I tasked, and I've said this publicly before, I tasked a committee with reviewing the 2008 comprehensive plan. And then from there, depending on what that comprehensive plan resulted in, taking a review of our existing zoning. I've said this before, when you stand up a group of people to do something, you may have hopes, but you really have no way of knowing what kind of a job they'll do until they start doing it. And I can't express enough how impressive this particular group has been. This committee, starting in 2018, has collectively put in many thousands of hours of 100% volunteer time and effort in reviewing the comprehensive plan, and now moving on to the zoning revision. So thank you to Ben for being the chair of that committee, and thank you to each and every one of the individual members of that committee for all of the time and dedication that you all have put into this important work.
Thank you. Yes, Thank you. So as Warren pointed out, we've been at this for a little while. This started in 2018. And I'm not planning to walk through all of this bit by bit, though feel free to read if you'd like. Overall, I think the takeaway here is this has been a constant kind of back and forth between committee work, listening to community input, presenting some sort of draft, hearing feedback, incorporating that back into a draft, bringing that draft to this village board for potential adoption, and that continual process of work, feedback, incorporating, and so on and so forth. This board at the end of 2021 adopted the comprehensive plan. That was a 4-ish year process with this committee. As that was happening, as that comprehensive plan was being adopted, this committee moved into looking at zoning. In the comprehensive plan, there are a number of places where goals are laid out that state a desire to see some changing in our zoning. A lot of it comes back to this kind of math problem that Roden talked about at the beginning, where growth is one of the tools we have in the toolbox to try and address some of the issues that we see in the village around housing, around affordability of housing, around affordability of tax rates and services and so forth. And so in the past 1.5 to 2 years, the committee's been working on residential zoning. And that is kind of the focus of where this board is at now. That a draft has been moved to this board. The board is now looking at that draft. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And hopefully we have time for engaging questions and Q&A here about that draft and see if that's really fitting purpose for what we're trying to get out of it. But the work doesn't stop there. This will continue over the next probably 2 or 3 more years, continuing to look through more of the parts of our zoning. We're also talking about short-term rental regulation right now. And so that's an opportunity for people to jump in and have a comment there. There will be a draft at some point. There'll be feedback. The whole cycle continues. And we'll continue to move through the rest of the zoning at that point as well. But general overtake is it's a long process. It'll continue to be a long process. There will be lots of opportunity for comment and revision and feedback and incorporating that throughout the whole process. That has been the bedrock that this has all been kind of placed on. So with that, I'll then kind of start talking about our residential zoning revision. And this kind of, like I said, goes back to what Roden was saying with the math problem, that Trumansburg really is struggling to remain affordable. As Roden mentioned, there are folks who are feeling that pinch now, worried about being able to stay in Trumansburg. Folks that have grown children looking to move back into the area, struggling to find a place to live in Trumansburg. There's already a real affordable issue, and we're kind of continuing to see that just worsen over time. There are many issues that go into that. I'm not trying to say that the housing market is kind of straightforward or simple in any way. But one of the key issues that happens there is a lack of inventory in housing. And so this is a graph that I pulled from real estate data in the area. This is for the whole zip code, but it starts all the way in 2016. Trying to kind of read some of the numbers there. Moving through kind of the end of last fall. And you can see that the active listing just absolutely plummets by about early 2021. There are just not a lot of opportunities for people to buy houses in Trumansburg. And yet there are a lot of people that want to move here. And those two things interact, and that pushes up the prices, right? As there's less inventory, more people looking to move here, more people bidding those up. If you talk to anyone who's tried to buy or sell a house recently, there are multiple offers. They're all over asking. It is a kind of incredible market that's out there right now. And what we're seeing is that the zoning we currently have, that's again only part of the many pieces that go into the housing market, but it's the part that we're talking about at this board and that we have the most influence over. And it's not delivering kind of the housing that we need. So with that kind of being the backdrop, that was identified really as an issue in the comprehensive plan. Again, talking about those goals that focus on how do we get more affordable housing? How do we get more affordable rentals? How do we build those into, what can we do with our zoning to try and encourage that the best that we can as a board, knowing that obviously it still depends on people wanting to build those things and the financing for those and all the other different pieces that go into housing. So the proposal that's currently out there, and this is on the website, there's a whole page about it. There's also a in-depth FAQ. There's also all the draft documents if you want to dig really deeply. But I did want to kind of highlight the key, I think the key pieces of the proposal for folks that haven't looked at it or haven't had the opportunity. And it might help as a kind of basis for a conversation here. So one of the key focuses is reducing lot sizes for lots with 1 to 4 units on it. So that's a single family house or maybe a duplex or more. But for those smaller builds that we see throughout the whole village, we see a number of single family dwellings, a number of 2-unit and 4-unit buildings all throughout the village. And the idea is that this is actually matching what we already see in the village. So we did a large study of tax assessment data that allowed us to see how many units do we see on what lot sizes in the village. And we changed with the proposal is matching what we actually see in the village today. Part of that is that it creates more opportunity for other houses like that we already see in the village, but is denser than some other parts of the village. Part of that also helps with reducing the amount of just administrative overhead needed to make any changes to these units that were built in the village, are part of the structure of the village, but would have to go through a lot of oversight and review to make any sort of added addition or whatever it might be, just because they don't fit with the zoning that currently exists. So that kind of gets us to kind of back to the allowing what we already see in the village. And then we wanted to go one kind of increment more flexibility in development to try and build that growth in without kind of, as Gordon said, going to high-rise apartment buildings. The key piece there is an accessory dwelling unit, an ADU. This is a common practice we're seeing in more and more places. There's even been at different times conversation at the state level of allowing them throughout the entire state. But this is the idea of a garage apartment in the back of the garage, over the garage, an in-law cottage in the backyard, something like that, where it's one extra unit, smaller than the existing primary unit on the lot. It allows you to kind of add in a little extra density, ideally without changing radically the kind of sense of community and the structure of the neighborhood. Continuing forward, we talked about parking requirements. This is another thing that can kind of get in the way of that next increment of development. If you're requiring 2 spots for every unit, but maybe you want to build a couple 1-unit, maybe a 4-plex that has 1-bedroom units, you would have to build 8 parking spots, but you wouldn't have any real reason to actually need that with what you're kind of building. So you want to build this flexibility in that allows people to create the amount of parking that they actually need and doesn't prohibit additional development that we might want to encourage. That might be discouraged just because of the parking requirements, and parking is not cheap. It increases stormwater runoff. It has a number of other issues that kind of crop up and can prevent some of the development that we're looking to build. So then balance that kind of first 3, I kind of see this as the top 3 is like, where are we encouraging or making flexibility for potential new development? The next 2 is where are we kind of also honing that in and restricting that in a way that makes sure that the development is as best as we can fit for purpose at Trumansburg. One of the things we heard coming out of 46 South Street was a concern with a multi-unit of 46 unit sort of apartment building. And so one of the things the new proposal brings in is this idea of prohibiting more than 20 units on a lot. That doesn't say that you can't take a 5-acre lot and split it up and make a number of different smaller units, dwellings, but it does focus that development on kind of smaller scale development, something that fits more with the character of the village, something that is often then built by local development, and has a lot of kind of benefits to tailoring that development and really focusing on those smaller units, 1 to 4 unit sort of houses that fit into the feeling of Trumansburg. The other kind of proposal piece in there is this idea of having infill development match what's around it. And there's a number of different ways that you can go with this, but the proposal says, if you think about walking down Wig Street, very different feel from walking down Larchmont Street. And the primary difference, I think, when you kind of sit there and think about it, is how far back from the road are those buildings? There's a number of different differences, but But that's the primary one, is you have this kind of very walkable neighborhood feel. When houses are closer up to the road, you have more of a suburban spread out feel when houses are farther away from the road. Wanting to keep that feel from neighborhood to neighborhood. The idea is that infill houses have to kind of stay in line with the other houses around them. Helps create that feel and keep that consistency across the village. And this was something we heard a lot about, maintaining that character. And this is the proposal's approach to how to try and work that in. I think this is one that I'd be most curious to hear feedback on. I've heard that some people really think this kind of helps get that feeling of character, keep maintaining character. Other folks have said, hey, we have houses that are forward and back from each other all across the village. Maybe that is the character of the village and we shouldn't be so prescriptive. So I'd love to hear kind of feedback on that piece. And the last piece I'll say, just a kind of brief moment. We had a lot of manufactured home park regulation in the current zoning. That has actually all now been usurped or overridden, I don't know, by state law. That is not allowed to be regulated any separately from any other single family home. So we had to remove a lot of that piece, but that's kind of a technicality there. The last thing I'll just say is that this proposal came out in the middle of the year. There was a lot of feedback at that point, a public information meeting, a lot of emails and Facebook comments, and the committee took all that back in. As I was saying, this whole process is a very long, iterative process of feedback, input, revision. There have been two really major revisions to the proposal since then, based on that feedback. The largest change was the original proposal kind of reduced lot sizes for 5 to 20 unit buildings. And there was a real concern about how dense that would look. What would that really do to the community? Is that in keeping with what we see in the village? And after hearing a lot of feedback and talking about it as a committee, that's all been removed. So now the only lot size change proposal is only for those 1 to 4 units. And that was a very massive change to the original proposal. The other changes we heard a lot about affordability. Were we targeting the right kind of income brackets for affordability? Was it expansive enough? And so one of the larger changes we also made since the initial proposal is expanding the affordable housing incentive to even lower income households. And so that was a large piece of feedback we heard and a change that was made. So that's a lot. There's a lot of detail there. Like I said, there's more information on the website. There's an FAQ there, and then this rest of this period is primarily for conversation about zoning. Would love to hear more about it, get people's feels on that, and have some questions and answers.
Thanks, Ben. We are now officially way ahead of schedule. So that means we have a lot of time for Q&A. I will actually, I'm actually going to unilaterally make a quick change to the agenda. I want to mention this volunteer firefighter tax exemption now, and then we can just go straight into Q&A about anything zoning related or anything else you heard today, and or anything else you want to ask village related. It doesn't have to be something specific to today's agenda. Volunteer firefighter tax exemption was something that was passed in 2022 by New York State. It allows for municipalities to opt into a partial tax exemption of, I believe it's up to 10% of the property's value is exempted from property tax to that municipality, which is opted in. For those folks who are volunteer members of a volunteer fire or ambulance company, if they have been volunteers for at least 2 years, and if they live in the jurisdiction that that volunteer company covers. If submitted. As most things that get passed in Albany, the details were a little fuzzy as to how that should be implemented. But Tompkins County Assessment has finally been able to come up with a formula that works. However, the deadline for volunteers to apply for this tax exemption is March 1st. So the village will be holding a public hearing on Thursday, February the 16th at our budget meeting that evening on a local law which would allow for volunteers who live in the village who also volunteer for this fire company and this fire company alone to opt into this partial tax exemption, should they choose to. So this is a bit of a formality today to announce it, to announce the public hearing, essentially to have introduced the concept of this local law, which will be published in draft form online, and we'll have a public hearing for it on the 16th. And with that, I will move us to our open Q&A about anything related to anything we've talked about today. Obviously, zoning is the big one, but there's been a lot of other things we've talked about, so. There's also refreshments remaining. If you don't avail yourself of them, Tammy will be taking them home and she doesn't want to do that. So. With the microphones, I hope it won't be too distracting. If people want to help themselves, please do. And with that, we will kick off Q&A with whoever would like to go first.
Doris, I'm coming to you. Okay, I have a question about, in the zoning about reduced parking. Permitted 2 spots to 1 per unit. Now, are we saying per unit is a unit, a house with the primary house? Versus the ADU that might be added on?
So the unit here is per dwelling. So if it's a single family, that's 1 unit. If it's a duplex, that's 2. ADUs are considered kind of thought about separately. ADUs do not have a parking requirement. So you can have up to 1 ADU that does not require parking. The thing though, I know parking's a very interesting conversation. I think a lot of people.
I'm not done yet.
Okay, all right. I'll launch that after.
Yes, if you take a swing around, the village, on any given Saturday morning, say, you're going to find at least, there were in many cases, 2 cars in 1 driveway. And maybe 3, because there could be 2 adults and let's say another family member with a car. So then you've got 3 cars in the garage or in the driveway. And then you've got dwellings that are well, there are 2-unit houses. And they would have as many as 4 cars in the driveway. Now, if we're taking away parking, that we don't have to have parking for cars. People are not going to actually be able to park on many of our village streets because technically, depending on if the village wants to be hard nosed about the parking, is that you're supposed, if you're going to be parking on the street, all 4 wheels have to be off of the pavement. In many cases around the village, that's not possible. So that means the car is going to be parked half of the street and half on the yard, if you want to call it that. And so they could actually get a ticket. And so how do you address that when you've got 1 unit and you don't have to require parking? Where are people going to park?
So I would, a couple different ways of thinking about this. One is we're not removing any parking. As you pointed out, there's already 3 cars in a number of driveways. They're not required to build 3 parking spots, but they have them because they see the need and they've built them beyond what the zoning does or doesn't require of them. So zoning is setting a minimum bar. But as we already see throughout the village, people build much more parking than is required. So this doesn't change that dynamic in any way. This just reduces the amount that zoning is requiring. The thinking there is that 2 spots makes a ton of sense for a single family, right? We're seeing 2, we're seeing 3 parking. cars parked in a driveway. If we start thinking about trying to build some smaller units in the village, some one-bedroom apartments, that sort of thing, that a duplex that's, 1 bedroom on both sides. That sort of smaller, development is the type of development that's more affordable for people. They can get in on their initial kind of smaller home. Maybe that's a stepping stool to another larger home later down the road. In those developments, folks don't need 2 spots. If it's a 1 bedroom that one person's gonna live in, and they want to, and they think it makes sense for them to build just the 1 parking spot. The village requiring them to build 2 parking spots that they don't anticipate the need for would create additional cost to that, would reduce the affordability of that, would increase runoff from the parking spots. There's a number of negative impacts of requiring more parking than is absolutely needed. Now, that doesn't prevent, like I said, anyone from building more parking that they think is necessary and that they would want. We don't prevent that right now. That currently already happens. So this is, I understand the concern of there's not a lot of parking in the village. Where are people going to park? But really, this goes back to the development. What do they think that they need? They will build what they need. We saw that conversation with 46 South Street. They've done a lot of research on exactly the needs for the type of buildings that they build. They estimated about a parking spot and a half per unit. When we require 2, that's more cost, that's more runoff. And so that's why we've seen a reduction in parking requirements for that development. And this is kind of building that same concept in. We're putting a floor, you need some parking. But beyond that minimum is up to whoever's building the structure to kind of understand what they think that they need. So that the village isn't preventing additional development just because they can't build the parking spots that they don't think that they do.
It seems to me that at least for the ADU unit, that we would want to require a parking spot off street because in some cases, you could have a family member or friend move into that ADU unit and they may have a car. So then it seemed to me that the homeowner that is provide parking space for that at least one. Aside from persons, well, yes.
I think the logic behind that, and I had the same exact question when I looked over the zoning thing. And how Ben explained it to me was, he said, well, why would we require, say, if you wanted to put an apartment above your garage? And you already have a parking drive, you already have a driveway. Certainly, we wouldn't expect you or require you to put in another parking spot when you already have a driveway that they can park in. I have a similar house in Trumansburg, a small house in Trumansburg, and if I were to put something behind my house, say for my mom, I wouldn't want to have to figure out or have the village require me to put in another driveway. I would want to use the existing driveway that I already have. So I think that made a more logical explanation to me. Because I was thinking exactly how you were at the beginning. I'm like, if people are gonna put all these out, why would you not require them to have a parking spot? And then I got to thinking about his explanation, and that made perfect sense to me that certainly if I did put something out in back of my house for my mom, I wouldn't want the extra expense of putting in another driveway because I already have one.
If that driveway holds 3 cars, then fine.
Right, but if it didn't, I would put in more parking.
You would need
Right, but if it didn't, I would put in more parking, so she could put her car in. So you're saying you don't trust people to do that? Right, okay, that's a good answer. That's a good answer.
Before we move on to the next question, I do see, and thank you to Tony,
on the Zoom for raising your hand. I'll get to you in a moment. If anyone on Zoom, joining us via Zoom, we have a little over 21 people online. If anyone online does want to ask a question, you will not be able to unmute yourself, so please use the raise hand feature, and I will be sure to get to you. Tammy.
My name is Bridget, and I live on Broadway Street. I have a question about design review or neighborhood review or any projects that come in. I was for another neighbor that's not required anymore, no neighborhood notification of surrounding properties when the new development is coming in. Is that true? And so
That is not true. We still send notifications to the adjacent property owners. There has never been a requirement for an entire neighborhood to be notified of anything. It's always property owners adjacent to the property where something is being where a application has been submitted for something to be done, that we notify the adjacent property owners. That still exists. That has not changed.
do they have any, are they listened to, or if neighbors get together and have questions, do they have any clout at all?
So the purpose of the notification is to notify the neighbors of whatever the public hearing might be related to the application. So if it's zoning board of appeals, planning board, whatever decisions they may have in front of them, depending on what the application is for, would normally require a hearing of some kind. So the notification to the adjacent property owners is to make sure they don't miss the opportunity to speak at those hearings.
I'll add briefly to the proposal. I think there's a slight change in the proposal that's worth kind of pointing out. For any development of 3 or more units, there would be a site plan review, which would then create that would go before the planning board. That would most likely require a public hearing, and that would have the notification then as well. So this isn't kind of build whatever side of the building you'd like willy-nilly without oversight. Once you get to 3 or more units, there is a site plan review process.
And to be clear, there are certain things that don't require site plan. So if you have, for instance, if the zoning allows you to build a garage and it meets the certain setback requirements, so there's no need for an application or any type of exception to be granted. All you need to do is get a building permit from Tom so that he doesn't show up and tell your contractor to stop working. There's no notification of the property owners in that respect, because you have the right to build that facility. If you want to put up a fence along your fence line and it meets all of the requirements in terms of height and distance from the property line, you don't have to notify your neighbor that you're putting up a fence. The neighbor will find out when they see the fence go up, that kind of thing.
When do they put notice on the property? If they aren't notifying beyond the adjacent property owners, when do they mark the property? With notice on the property.
The answer is to your right. Yeah.
If so the only time that posting on the proposed project site is required would be site plan review. It's not done if someone is just looking for a variance in seconds or that kind of thing. So a normal building under normal zoning, it meets all the requirements. There was no public posting as far as on the property. We do, of course, publish the public hearings on the website, on our social media, in the newspaper, and at 3 conspicuous sites in the village, which would be the post office, the bank, and village hall.
You have one question online, which I want to get to. Tony, we will be able to hear you as soon as you unmute, which I've just asked you to do.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, because I have two questions. The first one relating to ADUs, which my understanding is mostly used for extended family purposes. Are we including any use restrictions on ADUs, or can I put one up and rent it out or use it as a Airbnb? Can I do whatever I want with it, or are there use restrictions on the ADUs? Second question, relating to infill. I applaud the idea of zoning enabling housing that will reflect what else is in the neighborhood. Will there be any design guidelines to reinforce that?
So on the ADU use, the specifically around short-term rental, that is currently the conversation with the CPCR committee. We're looking at short-term rental regulations. So whatever comes out of that will apply to ADUs, the same as any other unit in the village. I don't know exactly where that's going to go yet, but that is part of that conversation. Outside of short-term rentals, I mean, it would have to still be a residential use, but it could be a rental, it could be an in-law, it could be kind of whatever it might be. But the short-term rental piece will be dealt with as part of short-term rental regulation. For the infill part, there isn't any design recommendations or guidelines. That was not part of something that was considered in the zoning. So it's really just looking at the front yard setbacks and encouraging that similarity between the different buildings.
Other questions? Where's Tammy? We lost Tammy. Go ahead, Tom.
I just wanted to get back to the comprehensive plan, indicative of the great committee work and the humility. They did not mention that we got an award from the American Planning Association, recognizing we're calling it appropriate in conjunction with the consulting firm EDR. And so such a well work with such effective.
Yes.
Thanks. Yeah, David.
Wondering if the board. Wondering if the board anticipates the improvement of the mobile home park of the state having more control, or will that be a problem?
But if you're referring to the changes in the zoning, the state doesn't particularly have more control. They've just said that mobile homes can't be regulated differently than single family homes. So I think what they were responding to is a number of regulations, including something like ours around the state, where it requires mobile home parks to only be in a certain area or has different restrictions on them. Ours was rather, I think in large part, kind to mobile home parks, but there are definitely other communities that were very unkind to mobile home parks. I think the state sees it as a viable, lower cost living possibility for folks, and have prevented now local governments from kind of trying to regulate them into certain areas or just allow them altogether. That's the change that happened at the state level that then caused us in the proposal to remove any regulation around the mobile home park specifically. I don't know if you wanted to say anything else.
I think that covers the broadest strokes in terms of this proposal. The answer for this park for Compass specifically is much bigger. There will be substantial state involvement just through financing efforts that are going on now at the park, basically to help us implement improvements out there. And by us, I should say me specifically working in my private position, my day job, I guess. So there's a much longer answer that I'd be happy to share, but it doesn't really relate to this proposal or this board. And I'll just add that if anyone wants to talk more about that, that is my day job. I would love to talk about it. I think it is a really important thing. Ben mentioned briefly that our zoning is kinder in some ways in terms of manufactured housing, but we still had fairly, I don't want to say stringent, but we still had restrictions on where that type of housing could go in the village. That from my perspective and also from the governor's is fairly inappropriate. So those options are now, I think, on the table for development in the rest of the village as well. So we're, the park is kind of this strange appendage on the village and sort of always has been both culturally and physically. And I hope that with this proposal and the governor's, the executive law, we can sort of start to move away from some of that stigma and some of that, isolation.
Yeah, there's really two, just to add on to that, there's really two separate issues with manufactured home parks. One is the change in state law simply says that local zoning can no longer say someone who wants to live in a manufactured home park, you have to live over there. Manufactured homes are single family homes, period. So if you want to put a single family home on a piece of property in an area that's residentially zoned, and that's your choice of home, New York State has now said that a local municipality can't say, too bad, you have to live somewhere else, or kind of shove you off into the corner. That's entirely separate from what INHS's purposes are for what most people still refer to as ABLs. That property has been had been woefully neglected for decades. And so and she's not here today, but Johanna Anderson, the executive director of INHS, every time I see her, I tell her, I'm just going to start following you around with the empty bag so I can pick up cash that just seems to fall out of your pockets, because she's a magician at getting state and federal grant funding for all kinds of things. So there's millions of dollars coming to the former Alvos Park in terms of water or sewer infrastructure, roads, long overdue improvements for the residents who live there. And to Ben's point, it's been something that it's been in my mind for years that it has always kind of felt like those folks are kind of part of the village, but kind of stuck out there. And this will hopefully go a long way to hopefully making them feel like part of the community. It's the other reason why I'm trying really hard to find money for sidewalk from the farmers market to Seneca Road and so on. So. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question of, are there any plans for a community center that could be used by seniors and after school people? Because like seniors, we come here for Tai Chi, but as senior citizens, there's no place to go, to hang out. Outside of like Ithaca, and then, like as you're a senior, you don't always want to go to that. And I noticed that, on South Street, I do a pipe thing, so on South Street, that Latter-day Saint building is available, is vacant. But, it would just be nice to have a center that would do for senior center citizens during the day. Oh, for seniors during the day and, after school for activities for the kids.
No, thank you. Community center is something that's always mentioned. I don't want to speak for anyone in terms of what could be done and where, but it's certainly something that we look at possible locations. That facility, the old Latter-day Saints Church, is outside of the village and has been sold. I'm not entirely sure at this moment, or I don't recall at this moment who purchased it. And I don't know what it's going to be purposed for. Within the village itself, it goes back to some of the things I said at the top of the meeting, which is, we want to do the things that make Trumansburg a desirable place to live, but they all cost money. And so we have to find ways to fund those efforts as we move forward, so that we can try to do all of the things, as they say. Actually,
Not that I think we need this.
add something quick. One second. 1 second, Jerry. Ben has something to add.
So one thing just to add quickly is that a couple of years ago, we transitioned our summer recreation program to the town of Ulysses, so they now administer that program. And one of the plans that we've been working with them on is starting to increase the programming from just youth-centered recreation to a sort of broader vision of recreation, arts, and generally entertainment within the town. So unfortunately, COVID happened and some of those plans were delayed, but that is definitely a direction that, and I don't want to speak for the town here at all, but it's a joint town and village funded program, and we're hoping to move in that direction as well. So that's not so much a community center, but definitely events and different ways that seniors could engage is, at least broadly speaking, something that we're planning on doing.
Just 1 second, Jerry. We have a hand raised online. Mark, go ahead.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks, everybody. I'll just start by saying, nice job running the meeting on schedule. That was much appreciated. And also for all the openness and conversation that I feel like gets engendered in our community. So thanks, everybody who serves. My comment is kind of more of an aspirational thing that I can't get out of my head. I'm just going to bring it up now because, you know, we got a little bit of an audience. You probably know there's 16 acres for sale down on Seneca Road, at the corner of Kingtown and Seneca, recently subdivided. Wouldn't it be cool to somehow come together and get a solar farm there that was also connected to a sort of microgrid that would enable the village to sort of maintain essential services in the unlikely but always increasingly likely event that the big grid goes down. Wouldn't that be cool? That's all I got.
Thanks, Mark. All right, Jerry, go ahead.
Jerry Kraus, 108 Seneca Road. I've been very vocal on Facebook and elsewhere about zoning changes and for a variety of reasons. I have several questions, they're kind of interrelated. I'll try to keep this focused, just get these questions, but I want to start by saying that I am not against growth, I'm not against progress, and I'm not against change at all. But I just think we need to be smart about it. The first question has to do with accessory dwelling units and the original question of the community in the survey and in the focus groups. I guess I'm wondering, how did we get from asking how should well, let me start by just saying, here's the question. Accessory dwelling, this is a goal. Accessory dwelling units, attached or detached, already exist in the village and are allowed within regulations. Open for aging parents, returning children, all the things we've talked about. Which, by the way, my wife and I are agents and wouldn't mind a place either. So just keep that. It says at the same time, new development have pros and cons. Cons being traffic, population density. Going forward, how should the village regulate accessory dwelling units, which is stated as something we already have? So I guess I'm wondering, how did we get from how should we regulate it? Answer being 70% said allow as long as they comply with general residential building regulations. So it sounds like it's something we had already. It seems a little bit deceptive to me because when I read that question, I said, hey, regulating, and I don't really care. But now it's become a goal in and of itself to solve our housing affordability, both for rentals and for sale housing. That's my first question. How do we get from
regulate them to it becoming an actual goal in our plan, which is not reversible, because that's already done. Another question I have is, if we had infill development, ADUs, how do we keep them from becoming another Airbnb? And why are we deferring the conversation on short-term rentals while we're talking about ADUs and infill development now? I don't know how that's gonna work. Another question I have is, if the goal is to increase available housing, how much will ADUs and infill development, how do we anticipate how much that will actually increase the affordability of housing, especially for sale housing, because it's not. To build additional dwellings on an existing property probably won't become anything for sale for anybody, affordable or otherwise. So I think just by cramming in units into spaces doesn't necessarily mean we're going to reduce tax base. So in a sense, I think those are conflicting goals. One goal is to increase the population of the village, by how much I don't know, by when I don't know. And maintain the character and atmosphere of the village. Those may be in conflict with one another, and I don't know how you balance it. Say you're going to, well, we all know that we don't have a definition of, or a way to measure the character or small town atmosphere. It's an intangible. Next, enforcement is my big issue. I honestly don't care what the rules end up being, as long as we enforce them consistently and accurately. We talked about giving permits if people don't get notified. Well, we also have to be careful that permits are being issued on structures that are pre-existing non-compliant, meaning they have setback issues. It requires a special review of some sort. Can we stop issuing permits on structures that are currently non-compliant? Because there's no going back. Last question on environmental overlay districts. These are setbacks and buffer zones of streams and wetlands in the village. In a recent approved variance that was granted, the BZA said that the 100-foot setback on wetlands was arbitrarily created by the prior administration and committee. And I guess it didn't hold water. So are we going to follow those guidelines or are we not? Which brings me to my last enforcement issue, and that is our track record now is, I think 22 out of 23 variance requests have been approved. Are we going to manage and administer our zoning by exception through the BZA? Or are we going to put rules, fix our philosophy on variances and say, look, unless you as the applicant have a good case, where you show you've been harmed somehow by this unfair rule, you shouldn't get a variance. And to deny one person their variance request, I don't understand that. How can one person, for any reason, when your track record is basing 95% approval, deny it? So I appreciate all the work that's been done, everything that's gone into it. I just think we need to rethink a couple of things. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. So there's a few things in there I wanted to respond to. One is, that I'm gonna wait for Tammy. The how did we get to part, I'm not going to speak for the CBZR, that's certainly, Ben can respond to those, but there's a handful of things I didn't want to state publicly in no particular order. The character of the village issue, I'm reminded of things that I've said in the past, which is prior to 1972, there was no zoning. There were some loose land use laws passed in the 50s. So most of in fact, with the exception of Larchmont and Tamarack, the bulk of the village of Trumansburg was built in a time without zoning. So when we talk about the character of the village, it's a bit of a misnomer to suggest that zoning has anything to do with the character of the village. The character of the village developed organically over a couple of centuries. So when we talk about maintaining the character of the village, yes, there are ways we can do that. We don't have to allow for shopping malls to be built. We don't have to allow for the high rises I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting. But when we're talking about fundamentally the individual right of the individual property owner to do something with their house, that pre-existed zoning. And so we come back to the math problem that I discussed at the beginning of the meeting. We are very soon, it used to be kind of a theoretical exercise until I did that cost projection on our EMS department a few weeks ago. We are within the next 6 to 7 years going to be faced with a situation where we can no longer support what I believe may be our most important department. Taking nothing away from DPW, taking nothing away from police. Those two departments don't operate outside our village very often, if at all. Our EMS department is becoming the sole provider of paramedic level support in between the two Finger Lakes. How are we going to continue to provide that? Maybe it's not our responsibility. But when I see the EMS calls come in on my phone and I realize that this emergent situation is just over the other side of Seneca Road, does that mean that if it's on the Legion or doctor's office side of Seneca Road, we're not going to respond? So those are the kinds of things that really keep coming back to being the most important key to this entire conversation. Is, are we going to be able to continue to support these services? And if that answer is yes, and if we agree that growth is our best option, then allowing the individual property owner their right to utilize their property in the best way they see fit with certain guardrails, then we have to accept that there's a freedom inherent to that. That may mean your neighbor may not like the 8-foot fence that I put up. But that's part of living in a community. Secondly, the whole concept of affordability speaks to the math problem from the beginning of the meeting. What's affordable to me may not be affordable to the next person or vice versa. So lost in this conversation, which New York State loves to talk about, Tompkins County loves to talk about affordable housing. That in and of itself, for the village of Trumansburg, is something of a red herring conversation. Yes, we would like to have housing that's affordable for more folks, but the bottom line is none of it is going to be affordable for any of us at some point in the future if we don't begin to make some of these incremental changes. A word about short-term rental regulation. The reason why it is not important to do short-term rental regulation before ADU policies are developed is because there is the high likelihood, based on our own attorney's evaluation, there's the high likelihood that much of the short-term rental regulation that you see being passed by other municipalities are going to fail under challenge. Simply because if a use is allowed in a district to then restrict what type of sub-use is allowed is considered or could be considered, if the courts end up reviewing it this way, could be considered an unlawful taking. If you allow for a residential use in a residential zone, but you say not that kind of residential use, where is the line? It's not a big step. I don't like playing this card, but it's not a big step to say it's a residential use in a residential zone, but you can't use it for certain people. Tourists are certain people, right? So we have to be, as a village, very careful. Happy to let the city of Ithaca and the town of Ithaca be the test case on how restrictive we are going to allow allowed uses to be used when it comes to short-term rental regulation. And the last thing I want to say, specifically to Jerry's question about variances. There is no mechanism for a municipality to dictate how many or how few variances the ZBA is allowed to grant. The variance process is, by definition, a constitutional right. So the last clause in the First Amendment allows us to petition government for redress of grievances. If a property owner feels that they are aggrieved for any reason whatsoever, they have a constitutional right to petition, in this case, the Zoning Board of Appeals, to address that. And then it is 100% up to that ZBA as a judicial body to determine whether any relief should be granted. And so I've had this conversation a number of times, again, with our village attorney. Any government at any level who seeks to restrict a ZBA's ability to grant 100% of the variances or 0% of the variances will fail, because it is literally a constitutional right for a property owner to request a variance for any reason whatsoever. And then the ZBA can certainly choose not to grant it if it seems frivolous. Did you want to address that?
I can say briefly on some of the other points. On the ADU front, I think you kind of pointed out exactly how we got here. We talked about it as a community. Most folks, 70+% said, sure, let's have them.
That wasn't the answer.
It's allow them with regulated.
They be regulated.
Right, and they're regulated, right, so they are regulated by building code, right? Which is what the answer is going back to, regulated by building code.
And the zone.
Right, well, and they will be regulated by both, so that is the survey there kind of encouraged us in that direction, as you look at current approaches to zoning that allow for this kind of incremental growth that we're looking for. ADUs are often a tool that come up, so that was another kind of reason why the committee looked at them. I don't remember off the top of my head if they were explicitly called out as a strategy in the comprehensive plan, but they may have been based on kind of that community feedback. And so here we are now at the zoning part, incorporating them into the zoning for all those reasons, right? So I think you're exactly right. That's how that process worked. There was a number of things. I'll briefly mention on Airbnbs. I would reject the concept that these are being treated wildly separately and at wildly different times. We're currently talking about short-term regulation, short-term rental regulation. Anything that comes out will almost certainly come out before any ADU is built under this particular zoning. So I'm not sure that I agree with the concept that they're going to be separated and looked at in an incorrect sort of way. On the balancing conflicting goals, I think you're seeing that balance, right? And when I kind of went through the process, we talked about the top three. So up here, top three items about encouraging growth, the next two items about restricting growth and managing that growth to kind of conform with the community and the culture, the character of the community. And so I think you're seeing that balance play out, and that balance is in the goals in the comprehensive plan that said both preserving community character, I can't remember exactly the wording, as well as looking for affordable housing options. So I think, again, we're seeing that balance all the way through the process. And then I think the last point you made around infill, the idea there is, that as we allow for slightly smaller lots that we already see throughout the community, allowing someone to maybe subdivide their lot, break off a little part, add a small house, that kind of one house at a time, little bit at a time is exactly the kind of incremental development we're looking for, not looking for high rises. We're not looking for 100 building apartment, complexes. We're looking for that person who decides to subdivide their acre lot into 2 half-acre lots and someone builds a duplex on the other side. That sort of incremental additional build can bring in that affordability by building those smaller units, by building on smaller lots that we are now allowing that are already existing in the community, but we're kind of re-allowing those to be an option on the table. And that does slowly increase the tax base because there is now an improvement on that land. There is more taxable value on that land, and that might be a more affordable house to be built. So that's all how this approach is kind of how we've taken the approach to kind of come to this point where we are with the proposal.
Yeah, I got a nice point that I wish to thank Jerry about it, that he brought up a very important issue. The ZBA board and the zoning law, that he totally ignored on the property. When you hired Tom Myers, he didn't send anything in the form I could read. A friend of mine could read it. He threatened me. And he would immediately to tell me this is more. But I stated to him in law, state law, I was required and mandated that I could be more than hard mentioned. Constitutional right tonight. I didn't get to go to the BBA board. So I want to know why. If my case is it because I'm blind, that I can be taken advantage of and you can run over them all over the place with these zoning courts code, but it never applies to me. And I want to know why.
Tammy, we got a question over here.
I don't need the mic. I don't think. My question is about the overlay districts and mapping, specifically wetlands. My property on Congress Street, about 4.5 acres. When you look at the map, it shows the entire property as being a wetland, where you're like in the back border of the property. I'm wondering if at some point you're going to kind of refine and those maps to really reflect, the actual wetlands.
Right, so the overlay districts was not part, kind of scroll back a couple slides, I don't know, maybe we can, but, the committee is taking the approach of kind of doing this 1/3 of the zoning law at a time to try and address the entire zoning law in one go is an overwhelming effort. Both for the board and for the community to review it, it's just overwhelming. So we're kind of going year by year, 1/3 or so at a time. I say that to say the overlay districts are in there. We haven't gotten to them yet. But we've heard a lot of concern. Tom runs into this all the time with exactly the issue you're talking about, that my understanding, though this is kind of third-hand knowledge at this point, is the original zoning. Well, I'll say for sure, the underlying wetland maps have been improved and updated since the zoning was initially done. We definitely want to look at those things. And I think to your point, the initial decision was made that if any part of the property had wetlands on it, the whole property was part of that overlay district. I'm not sure that's the most appropriate approach anymore. But I can't kind of say too much until we kind of dive into that. But it is a point that's brought up, and we're definitely looking at it.
One more comment, really, it's more of a rhetorical question about growth, just generally. Macro and micro. We can't have permagrowth. I mean, I think we're seeing that on the planet. And at what point, and I understand your predicament, how do we pay for these things going forward? Everything's getting more expensive generally. So at what point do we reach the limit, and is it paying for itself? At some point you do reach a limit, everything gets more expensive, and then you're essentially at the final wall that you're finding yourself at now. So I don't have any of these answers. None of us probably do, but I think it's a point to consider. Where is the end?
So that question is actually a lot less rhetorical than you think. There is an end. We're not there yet. How do we continue to pay for certain things? The EMS question in particular, because it's our single largest department. That gets to conversations with, which are happening with our neighboring municipalities and regional authorities. How do we more efficiently deliver services, spread those costs out over a wider area, kind of thing. We have a tremendous advocate in Assemblymember Kellis, who has taken it on as one of her personal quests to help answer the ambulance cost structure question. She and I have co-authored legislation, which she has introduced in the Assembly, and Senator Michelle Hinchy from the Albany area has introduced it in the Senate, to try to get the state to accept the fact that this extremely important service can't survive long-term without state aid. The state has accepted that role when it comes to things like school districts. The state has accepted that role when it comes to all manner of other things. And it's a frustration of mine because the governor, though she is from upstate New York, and I think she probably understands this issue a little bit better than some, her staff, some members of her staff, and certainly New York State's budget director have taken the position that EMS services are not Albany's problem whatsoever. We are not going to address it in our budget. And so there has to be a real continued effort, a continued push to get Albany to recognize what is our most expensive department. To get them to recognize that this is something statewide that they need to step into. So it's things like that, you know, so where is the end? The end is when we have tapped into all of the resources that we have at our disposal that we have not yet tapped into. What that means in terms of when will we not, certainly, if we go back to that EMS map, we're not going to be the ambulance provider for the entirety of the Finger Lakes. So you run into limits to capacity first, and then you run into problems with how to pay for it. The change, certainly in my view and in my tone over the last several months, the change is because I now see a definitive date. It's not just, we're gonna run out of money sooner or later. It's, we have a June 1st budget year, June 1 of 2030. If nothing changes, that'll be by June 1 of 2030, if not much sooner. We may not be able to support one of our most important departments. So having that kind of line in the proverbial sand, which is concrete from a dollars and cents perspective, helps kind of beat all of this. And it frankly, it increases my sense of urgency when it comes to things like conversations with congressmen and state level folks to do their part for in the best interest of their constituents.
I know many people here that are prolific postcard writers to their senators and their legislators, and I urge all of you to get your postcards out again and write everybody and tell them that this is a definite need that all of these small municipalities need, and that they need to consider ambulance care, EMT, that is healthcare, and they need to support it. Because this can't go in the long term. Get your postcards out.
Yeah, and in the back.
Hi, I'm Dan Brown from Prospect Street up there. I had a couple questions, comments. One is mostly on the affordability, which is great. The AD thing, I think it's wonderful and all that, but I'm a little concerned about how durable the affordability is if it is implemented. There's I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, and stop me if you discuss this the first half hour when I wasn't here. But it seems to me there's two things. One is for rental, affordable rental. You need to remain affordable for 50 years. But if it's an affordable sale, the owner can sell it on the market after 5 years, if I read that correctly. And I don't know why. I mean, why would it be 50 years too? The other problem too is on the rentals, they can be converted to sales. And that there's provision in the language for that. So after putting in with these rentals, so if the owner decides, well, I'm gonna make condos out of these or affordable condos for 5 years, then there'll be market. So it seems to me like the worst case scenario, even if you find an affordable way of having affordable housing, these restrictions have no more durability than 5 or 6 years. And all this affordable housing would then be market after that. Potential that is being put. But it seems like that needs to be reworked a little bit.
to make sure that this affordable housing is affordable for the people that will buy and to rent it for a long time. So that's the first thing on that. The other is, it wasn't quite clear from the draft I saw online. What exactly the affordability line is. And I guess the median income for each village now about 62,000. So I'm guessing that you want people that have that household have that income to be able to afford housing. So we know that too, but people have, which means that I guess a housing unit for household would be around $700 a month for rent, and payments on the house would be something like that too, 30% of half of 62,000. And so I guess you probably did talk about this. I'm just curious as to where, at what point is housing more affordable in terms of, you know, the prices are set. I guess the probably move with inflation. So those would be my two questions. One is, how are you going to make affordability durable for 50 years or more with what's written in there now, and where, how affordable, where is the line drawn in terms of the income that you're going to ask 30%?
So thank you. Good questions. There is an issue which I have seen in some of the discussions online and elsewhere that is actually very poorly understood. The New York State dictates what can be considered affordable housing. So primarily, so you or I could go build a house for, well, now $300,000, and we could choose to sell it for less and take a loss. That's not affordable housing. It could be affordable to the person that buys it, but that's not the state's definition of affordable housing. The state's definition of affordable housing are those properties which will qualify for certain incentives, both state and federal in nature, including reductions on real estate property assessments. And so I think it's, don't hold my feet to the fire on this, I think it's section 467J of the real estate tax law. Section 467J defines what affordable housing will qualify for certain tax reductions. And it has to be in New York State, property owned and held in trust by a not-for-profit company that is subject to both HUD, federal and state regulations. So this notion that, you know, any of us could go buy the 13 acres that Mark mentioned on the corner of Seneca and King, and we could just build affordable housing is actually not fact. That's not true. It has to be certain types of entities which qualify under state law. So your question really comes down to, do we need to restate in our zoning all of the requirements already in place in state law to define what is affordable housing and what isn't? All of those requirements, particularly the HUD and state requirements, have these long time frames, 50 years, 99 years. All of these long requirements in order for these organizations to be able to do this type of real estate business. I don't have a personal opinion about whether we need to restate all of those things in our zoning. It seems redundant. You know, we don't have a law against murder on our books in the village. We know it's illegal because it's illegal at the state level. So I don't know that we need to restate all of those things, but it may be something that the committee will want to reference those pieces of state law somewhere. That could be a viable compromise. It's much longer. It's much longer. So the state and federal programs under which in Ithaca neighborhood housing or used to be better housing or Juniper, for instance,
those programs operate under federal and state programs that have long-term requirements to their affordability, 50 years, 99 years, or whatever the case might be. So whatever is stated in the zoning would fall under those requirements in terms of longevity, in order to be considered affordable housing in the first place.
This is to kind of add a little detail to what Warren said. The intention with the law is to kind of be a baseline minimum with the expectation that any funding that these buildings would be built under will have much larger and longer term restrictions. But we didn't want to go like to a 50 or 100 year and then not allow some of this development to be built because the terms of the and conditions of under the funding is less than our zoning. So we took the approach of having a baseline of a minimum. It's a below minimum. I completely agree with the expectation that any funding sources that these builds would be built under are going to have much longer requirements. So if we look at 46 South Street, for instance, there's much longer requirements than 5 years on the affordability of those apartments. Though the approach in the zoning is just to have that minimum there, but with the expectation that the funding sources would be having a higher bar for that. Part of that reason is that if it does fall to just the village to enforce it, unfortunately, we're not really in a place to track and understand this over multi-decade terms. We are focused, we have the ability to kind of track and manage it in a smaller term. And so if it falls to the village, we have that capacity. But the expectation again is that these funding sources will have a much longer time horizon on them. We would like to see that. I will say that it still is a benefit to the village to have affordable, even for 5 years, right? We have someone who came into the village who wouldn't have been able to otherwise afford, who buys a home, who builds some equity. There's real value there, and I wouldn't want to get away from that. Obviously, there's more value in keeping it even longer, having that turnover, having other people get into that, continuing that cycle. And that's where we hope to see that come through with that funding sources, because all of the state and federal funding sources have all those stipulations built in and are self-regulating at that point.
Anything else?
My name is Carol Football. I was at 4 Eldorado Drive. I just want to make a comment. I feel compelled to make a comment about what Bruce Stratcott said about his incident or what the local restaurant here regarding the ADA laws. I have a son who was born with type 1 Usher syndrome. My son is profoundly deaf, uses American Sign Language to communicate, and he is blind due to retinitis pigmentosa. The ADA has been a law for a long time in the United States, and individuals and businesses interpret it differently, and it's been a problem ever since it was initiated. My son is currently the director of deafblind services at the Deaf Stone Center in Pittsburgh. So he has his own apartment down there. And that apartment, which I recently went to visit just before Thanksgiving, had regular smoke detectors in it, which he can't hear. So basically, we've been in touch with a property management company, Berkshire Hathaway, to basically have them remove those smoke detectors and put in strobe lights, smoke detectors, which they have refused to do. So now basically I'm required to buy smoke detectors for him, strip them down to him, and hope to hell that property management installs them for him. So basically, this is an issue. I think most people think, well, it doesn't pertain to me. But basically, whether you have an individual in your family, that has a disability, or actually we all get old. Some of us are going to be using wheelchairs and other equipment later. This is really something to think about because, like I said, it's always going to be an ongoing fight with either individuals or businesses. And something to think about. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have a timeline for Crescent Point?
I am of the last information I have is that we're going to start seeing some site work this spring. So it'll be infrastructure first, water, sewer, roads. And that is, as far as I know, is slated to begin. When and if the ground thaws. Now, go ahead.
On that same topic, has MRB coordinated the ground or the stormwater plan with the proposed 46 South Street development?
So MRB is not the engineer for the developer. They're using TG Miller is the engineer for the developer, and they have their own on-site stormwater plan for the site to be developed. What MRB is looking at on the Larchmont Tamarack side of things is expectation of flow, right? So if we look at a topographical map of that piece of land, a fair amount of it actually flows to the north towards the middle school, really. And then some of it flows to the south to Larchmont and Tamarack. So what MRB, the proposal they showed us had three options. And basically the option we're most interested in is one which will have the capacity to accept flow and move it away to the east. And that should be able to accommodate, based on their calculations, should be able to accommodate large rain events, changes in flow from the 46 South Street property south, and so on. Some of the other options we looked at that they suggested in their report, which they have yet to finalize, were more kind of property specific. Well, if we move water from this property to this location, then that'll alleviate the issue here, but won't allow for increased stormwater flow in the event of X, Y, or Z. So the one we're most interested in is designed to be able to accept that type of change. So the answer is it's not that MRB has done the study for the developer to accommodate what we expect. It's more that changes we hope to be able to make on Larchmont and Tamarack should be able to accept whatever happens.
Thank you.
I have a question then. Are you gonna include the drainage on Larchmont and Tamarack before the beginning of South Street? Because right now there is a drainage problem on Larchmont and Tamarack.
The answer is I want to improve the drainage on Larchmont and Tamarack as soon as is humanly possible, which means when we can get funding.
But you didn't answer the question. Before you start the development on South Street, like right now, those of us who live on Tamarack and Larchmont have drainage problems in the spring, fall, summer sometimes, depending on the season. So if that unit on South Street is built before the drains are fixed, it's not gonna be a nice scene.
So we don't know, number one, we don't know that the development, when it begins on 46 South Street, we don't know what that will do to drainage to the south. Part two, and the reason I say it that way is because the development itself has its own stormwater management piece to it. So ideally, you won't see, we can't say that it won't be a pleasant scene because the stormwater management on site should handle the stormwater on site. Second piece to it is that's a private developer with a on private property. So the village needs to do, in my opinion, the village needs to do improvements to drainage on Larchmont and Tamarack, which frankly has not been the village's position for the last 30 years. The village's position for the last 30 years is this area was built out one house at a time by a private developer. It's not the village taxpayer's problem if you have water. I have shifted that focus to say, we do want to take care of the drainage and stormwater issues on Larchmont and Tamarack. And so that's why we paid the engineering firm to develop this proposal. I hope they have it finalized this month. And then we can begin to see funding options depending on how much it costs. Again, if it's $100,000, I can feel fairly confident that we can find that fairly quickly. If it's $1 million, we're going to need some help from other funding sources. So the short answer to your question is the two are not linked in time. The developer at 46 South Street will follow their timeline as their funding allows, and the village will take care of stormwater and drainage on Larchmont and Tamarack as our funding allows.
Back on stormwater, is there a definite engineered plan now for the Seneca Street, Congress Street stormwater mitigation? Is that,
Yeah, there's been a design for that for a year or two now. And we had anticipated trying to get to it this past year and, for a variety of reasons weren't able to, but my impression is that's been a contract and bid out. I think we're already finalized on it. So the hope is to see that this spring or summer.
how invasive it's going to be?
I unfortunately don't have a lot of those details right in my head, but absolutely feel free to reach out to me, and I can find the kind of diagrams again and pass them along and have you take a look at what's proposed there.
Congress and Seneca shouldn't be too bad. It's the addition, if I recall correctly, it's the addition of a couple of culverts in the right of way. And then some improved drainage to existing stormwater flow, and then some trees will have to be removed. So I think the most invasive part,
Hope not before I just planted.
the most invasive part, and certainly the part that people feel the most connection to are the trees. But in a couple of spots, there are some trees which are directly affecting the ability of the water.
You know what side of the street?
That I don't remember. Other questions? Yeah, Tom.
Just a couple of clarifications about the zoning process. When somebody comes into my office with an application for an appeal, I speak with them about it, advise them, well, they're usually covered with solid waste. Which is pretty shaky. Have them make a decision whether to go forward to $50, take up the time of the board of zoning appeals, frankly, B2. And then they make the decision whether they're coming out of the board or not. So, you know, we talked about the 23 with only one that was rejected. I advised them not to go in front of the board because I didn't think they would approve it. So it could have been 100%. But I see probably a third of the people that come in my office with applications, I advise them not to go to the appeal. I can't tell them not to. It's their right to spend $50 at that time before they start coming in for whoever really is in this month. And then they can speak their cases. But I have a pretty good idea about what may be rejected or accepted. And I give folks that information so that they can do it all around it. But it's never thing. There's a part of it you don't get people come up with that. Advise them to make their own. And the zoning ordinance, the current zoning ordinance, there is provision for repairing and frankly even increasing the size of the existing non-compliant structure. Code does not want buildings to fall down, we point out, because they were built.
Heavy, Mike.
Thank you. Because they were built 80 years ago on a non-compliant site, because there's no ordinance. That's pretty simple. It's early on in the ordinance. And to wetlands, the federal and EPA wetlands buffer 50 feet, the village zoning decided that they were going to increase that by an additional 50 feet. So to have an extra level of group, frankly, added, if somebody wanted to build someplace that was within this 50 foot, 100 foot buffer, that could be considered. That go through site plan review, it has to go through scrutiny of the board of zoning appeal. So it's not like things are really nilly allow people to put them into it. The conditions, situations are listed.
Thanks, Tom. Got about 10 minutes left if we have any additional questions.
I just need to respond to Tom's comments. I understand, and from what Ward has said, that, you know, number of variances, percentages don't really matter. But the guidance from New York State and others regarding variances and zoning really say that it needs to be a unique circumstance. And since everybody gets a variance, then I guess it's not unique. To say one person has building next to the property line, that's unique. There's 136 of those in the village, so it's not really unique. So I will say that. And then, you know, Tom, you are both the zoning enforcement officer and the code enforcement officer. You receive in building permit application. Part of what's on there is the zoning review. I don't know what your process is for doing the zoning. But if it's a pre-existing non-compliant building, someone wants to touch and fix up, according to the zoning ordinance, then they need to have not a site plan review, it's the other one, there's P, whatever it is. But it still needs to have a review. I will also say that when it comes to the process, you look at the zoning ordinance, it does talk about when someone has a complaint of violation. And I'll go back to what Bruce was saying. I had a complaint of violation in a particular issue in my backyard. And the zoning ordinance and the guidance documents say, well, you should be able to go before the zoning board of appeals. I was denied that opportunity, and Warren, as I said earlier, advised me if I didn't like it, I could file an Article 78. That's a difference too. Should be able to resolve these things, should be able to follow the rules and the procedures as they're written.
Any other questions?
None at all. And no questions online. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. Additional questions can always be sent to us via email or in person, and enjoy your frigid Saturday. And yes, if you have any interest in our spending, come to our budget meetings over the next month and a half.
Yeah. So I spent the morning hauling crawl space blow dryer. Yeah, this morning was more fun. How much fun did I miss? Yeah, you covered it. I did, but it was a little clunky, but it checked them